In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they're still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers that I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is much in the news, especially since DEI has been translating into DIE so much lately. Consider the case of billionaire Hamish Harding, who didn't want to hire 50-year-old white guys because it wasn't inspirational. He yearned for a more diverse crew when he wanted to take a submarine down into the ocean's depths. Needless to say, the 50-year-old white guys told him that the vehicle wasn't safe, so he fired them, got a more diverse set of advisors and technicians, whereupon he immediately perished as his sub was crushed by the tremendous pressure of the watery abyss. Outcries have been going up too as corporations are placing travelers' lives at risk by prioritizing diversity over qualifications, such as airlines hiring black female pilots who failed their tests or air traffic controllers with more melanin than experience, or hiring maintenance crews based on condescending tokenism rather than on competence. So no thinking person was surprised when accident ratios spiked and airplanes started to burst into flames while in midair.
Mom! I wonder if they're doing an emergency. Oh. No, it's still doing it. It's still doing it.
Maybe places like United Airlines are prioritizing diversity because their own CEO, Scott Kirby, has a thing for alternative lifestyles, as a recent clip of the embattled 56-year-old executive divulged. Actor James Woods, clearly at a loss as to society's misplaced priorities, spouted off at a propaganda ad that asked, "I dare you to name a single thing more important than diversity," whereupon he offered up, ability. Here to discuss the idea of complex systems breaking down due to a society that's fostering its own IQ collapse is Johannes Koenraadt. He speaks and writes about the decline of Western civilization and its implications. He's published books and novels as well as a podcast, The Great Johannes, and runs a popular TikTok channel.
Welcome, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So how is, if I may ask before we begin, how did you end up in Hungary?
I've traveled a lot in my life. So I think when I was 26 years old, I left the Netherlands for the first time because I'm Dutch, right? I'm from the Netherlands. And I did an internship in Munich and I stayed in Germany for a few years. Then I went back to Amsterdam. I spent some time in New York City and other places. And then effectively when COVID happened, we were locked out of a lot of services in the Netherlands because I'm not, I don't know if I can talk about this if you want to put this on YouTube, but I was, maybe you'll edit it later, right? So,
or
anyway,
just,
I did not
just speak in euphemisms.
I did not get the needle.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I was locked out of the nightlife and so on, and basically normal life. And I felt like, okay, I had enough of this. So I started traveling around a little bit and went to Sweden for a bit because everything was still open there. Mm-hmm. They had fairly a normal regime there, like one of the few European countries that did that.
Yeah.
And then I went to Hungary. Hungary also was far more lenient than what we had in the Netherlands. So I decided to just end up here for a little bit.
Far more free.
More freedom. Yeah. You can shop countries if you want more freedom in Europe.
Well, that's one of the things too.
Yeah.
Well, this might give you an insight, right? So what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, complex systems and, social systems and everything. And so you have like a good point of view on this because you've seen different systems, different countries, different kind of organizational principles. And so what is your big concern right now with, complex systems and the future of advanced civilization?
Okay. Well, that's a big question, but yeah. So what I usually talk about on my TikTok channel or on my live streams, which I sometimes do, is, what's the future of Europe? I see Europe right now as a sort of a battlefield between the old empires, like the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the East, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe both of those empires have an interest in either colonizing or destroying Europe, whichever it is. And then what's going to be left of us? What are we going to do? And so Europe has, after World War II, revived itself quite a bit, rebuilt the German industry and so on, right? And this kind of took away some of the market share from the USA after World War II, right? So what's going on now? Like, I get the feeling that there's no real leadership in Europe. The leadership is either in Washington or elsewhere, basically telling us to go along with the NATO program. We have to go to war with China and Iran and Russia and so on, that BRICS bloc, so to speak. And then, I I don't like I don't like the outcome of what might happen. Europe would either be like become a sort of backwater, like a new third world sphere with massive immigration, right? And what's going to happen to us natives? We're going to lose our culture and so on. We can't really live as who we are anymore. Uh, and I find that a bit problematic. Like, how do you deal with, like, what is Europe's future if all we are now is like vassals to a US overlordship? Then which direction are we going to choose? You know?
Well, I talk about what you just mentioned quite a bit, like right with Sir Halford Mackinder in 1904, and he talked about how traditionally geopolitical power was centered in Central Asia. That's where the Silk Road was. Three-fourths of global population, like 9/10 of all rare earth elements, like all these things are in Eurasia. He called the world continent, or excuse me, the world island
Yeah.
was Europe, Asia, and Africa. And he said, all the population, all the resources were there. And he said, but an anomalous thing happened when Columbus opens up the Americas. And he says the geopolitical power center shifted from about where Russia is all the way to the Atlantic. And the Atlantic for the, ever since 1500 anomalously became the power center. And Sir Halford Mackinder warned, he said, if you ever allow Germany to peacefully trade with Russia, if Germany gives Russia its technology and if Russia gives Germany its natural resources, he said the center of gravity will shift from the North Atlantic with the United States and England, and it'll shift back naturally to its historical norm. And he said, we have to do everything we can to stop this. So all of the wars that we've seen in the 20th century, there's a great book called A Century of War by
Uh-huh.
William Engdahl, who lives in Germany now. He's an American, but he talks about like how all the geopolitical struggles were essentially to separate. World War I was to stop the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, and the British created the Serbian nationalist movement because it went through Serbia, and they were blowing up the trains and all this kind of stuff to keep Germany from being able to trade with the East. World War II was the same thing. You see this like Iron Curtain. We need this Iron Curtain up. And that came from Hitler, and I think it was coined by Goebbels, the term Iron Curtain, and then Churchill uses it.
Okay.
So they were very useful to creating a separation between Germany and Russia and
Yeah, but
demonizing this.
that's not in the interest of Germany. So
No,
no,
which
no,
makes me
that's
wonder if Hitler was a an English puppet. I mean, we know that he was in military
uh-huh.
intelligence, and he admits that he was there to spy on kind of like the, socialist movements, subversive movements. And then, according to the story, he,
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
gets swept up and he defects and he becomes a true National Socialist, or he really was working for the Anglo-American power grid, and he really was like if you read Mein Kampf, he excoriates the Slavs. He complains about the Austrian Empire and how
Mhm.
it's treating its Germanic population badly, and it's incorporating all these Slavs, much like the United States with Mexico today, as an example. And he was like, "Why are all
Yeah.
these Slavs being let in, and the Slavs and the Slavs and the Slavs?" And he keeps talking about like the horrible nature of the Slavicization. And at the time, they called the Austrian Empire the melting pot. That was their term, the melting pot, which later was
Oh,
repurposed by the
yeah.
United States. And so he was very useful in creating that Iron Curtain that actually favors England. And he was very pro-English, pro-British Empire. Hess airlifts himself into England to try to negotiate with Churchill and stuff. So they were very big fans of the British Empire. There was I'm reading a book right now called Dream
Mhm.
Worlds of Race by Duncan Bell, and he's an English historian. And he
All right.
says the creation of the British Empire. And at one point, like they wanted to basically reincorporate the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Five Eyes countries into this Anglo world, he calls it. And
Yeah, the
he said
Anglosphere. Yeah.
he said only one force could have stopped it. And this was mentioned in the 1880s by a German diplomat. He said only one force could stop the English from doing this. And he said a pan-Germanic state in Europe, would be the
Was
only
that
way to
Otto
do it.
von Bismarck or was it someone
No,
else?
it was
No.
somebody I'd never heard of. The name will
Okay.
come to me soon, but I don't know if it was Strassman, but anyway, Gustaf Strassman. But yeah, but that statement was made, and so they made sure not to allow a pan-Germanic state to form
Right,
in
right.
Central Europe.
And it
Because
seems that that is still a threat today to the US leadership, right? If Germany would align with Russia. I mean, that's after all why I suppose the Nord Stream pipelines were bombed to
yep,
disconnect, right? And I know
correct.
there's more pipelines. There's one through Turkey as well, and they're thinking of blowing that one up as well because it feeds gas into Eastern Europe and so on. But
Yeah,
it's really strange that today we still have liquid natural gas supplied from Russia by Russian ships to the ports of Rotterdam, for example. So we still have to buy their gas, all right? But it's a very strange situation that despite all the war, the Russians are supplying us with gas, but we are still going to continue waging war on them. Well, I was thinking about this interesting thing which you mentioned. You have Otto von Bismarck did want to align with the diplomatically at least with Russia,
mm,
right, to basically make Germany strong. So you're
correct.
saying that in the World War One and Two was all about sabotaging that,
Yeah, well,
right?
they even said that, like when the Kaiser takes over and Bismarck kind of goes back into the shadows, and the
Mhm.
Kaiser and he immediately scotches all of those kind of agreements, those delicate agreements that Bismarck had created with Russia. Um, and everything falls apart, because of his incompetence, compared to Bismarck, who was a political genius. Bismarck, by the way,
Yeah.
he said in the 20th century, in the 19th century, he said in the 20th century, the two future powers are going to be the United States and Russia, simply because of their geographical, size and their natural resources. And he was absolutely right. He also predicted that the next big world war would start in the Balkans. So he
All
was a
right.
phenomenal, political analyst and thinker. And yeah, after he retires and the Kaiser he immediately messes up all of
Yeah.
those agreements.
Because the Kaiser was listening to different advisors, I
Maybe, I mean,
suppose. Yeah.
look at all those connections through blood and marriage. I mean, if you
Oh
if
yeah,
you
of
look
course.
at
Yeah.
Tsar Nicholas and his cousin, I can't remember, was it George the Sixth in England? And they look like identical twins, and they all have the same grandmother, like Queen Victoria. Like all of them were related to each other. They would
Oh, you
play
mean
with
they're all
each other.
connected to the British system in that sense?
Yeah, so I wonder if you look at the royalty, the royal links between Germany, around World War One to England, they didn't think England would attack them. They didn't think, they were cousins, literal cousins who would play with each other,
Mhm.
in Queen Victoria's like parlor. And so maybe that's why those agreements were scotched, because there were some sort of emerging kind of, like for instance, let me go back to that book, Dream Worlds of Race, and he talks about, and I want to make a point too. I was talking to a woman named Vicky Davis, and she made a really great point to me that when the British Empire goes bankrupt, right?
Mhm.
Usually empires end when they go bankrupt, like Germany, or any country that loses a war and they have to pay all these reparations and all these obligations to banks, and they lose all their power. But she made a really interesting point, and our conversation revolved around what rich people do. When rich people want to protect their wealth, they'll create a trust, right? And so you create
Uh-huh.
this trust at the top, so you have the trust, and then you have a holding company underneath that trust, and then the holding company might have a number of LLCs, a number of corporations under that holding company. So if they ever get sued, it only goes to the holding company. The people at the trust never lose their money, right? As long as you can get, kind of the revenues up to that trust, those are pretty much lock
Yeah.
solid safe. And so she made a really good point that after World War One, Britain was bankrupted. And what they did was they created an LLC. They created a trust called the League of Nations, right? And so they create this economic way to still have the same control, but not have to pay their liabilities, right? So you have all the power with none of the liabilities of an empire. Like in an empire, if you want to take over a place, you've got to build aqueducts, you've got to build rail, you've got to
Mhm.
build roads and maintain infrastructure, and it's very costly, right? But so they started losing their return on investment for their empire, and it started becoming very unwieldy, very expensive. And then all of a sudden, when they go bankrupt, British people come out and they, oh, we're going to create this new thing called the League of Nations, and it's going to be all about world peace, and it's going to have this trust at the top, and then it's going to have a holding company, which we'll call the League of Nations, and then it'll have LLCs, which we'll call countries, right? And we're going to basically control, you know,
Yeah.
And we're going to get all the money to still flow up to the trust, to these English, bankers and financiers. And then we'll have this holding company, which we'll call the League, and then it'll control
Is
the
it like a
world like
way
an
to
empire.
export their losses? Maybe like if they have a lot of losses, they can get other countries kind of
Yep.
through, I don't know, through kinds of trade balance or whatever, make other people pay for it.
Correct. And that's
Yeah.
what it is. Like when you tax,
Oh, yeah.
and the United States saw through it. And so the League of Nations fails, right? And so the Senate in the United States, they were like, wait, this is just empire by another name. You've created a corporation, a corporate empire. This is really, unheard of. And so they didn't go into it. And then after it failed, the British created, like there was this magnate, this rich British guy named Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes wanted to, as I said, he wanted to reincorporate the United States into the British Empire and Canada and
Yeah.
South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And that was his plan. And, the Anglo world, as Duncan Bell calls it. And he basically created when the League of Nations fails, they create the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. They create these things called roundtable groups in all the different countries, Anglophone countries, and their job is to create policy to brainwash politicians in those local countries and tell them that the way forward is globalism, is through integration, interdependence with this new. And then they create the United Nations. They take a second
Yeah.
bite at the apple. They create the United Nations, and it becomes that corporate state. And this is where I wanted to touch with you is um,
All right.
historically, Aristotle says that the basis of the nation state is the family, right? He says you have a family at the nucleus, and then if you have a bunch of cousins around that family, that becomes a tribe, and then you have a couple tribes, and that becomes a nation. And so there's an ethnological component to a nation state, and in fact, that's where the word comes from in Latin, natio, and where nation comes from, and it's the same root word for gene. So it literally means tribe born from the same gene pool, is what nation literally means. And so, but once
Yeah.
we go away from that model and we go to this new corporate model, now the organizing principle is not race, but economics,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll try to paint a little bit the picture of what's going on in Europe. Like in Europe, our nationalities, like being Dutch or being French or German, is very much tied to your ethnicity, basically. So it's a bit different than in the USA where everybody's an American. If African Americans would come to Germany, they might probably be called people from Ghana or Nigerians or something, because we see nations still as somewhat similar or synonymous with our ethnicities, right? And so yeah,
Logical.
in the past century, so I don't know when it happened, but maybe around the time of Bismarck to now, we have transformed this European system into much more of a economic system. We've become very materialistic, in my view, right? But I noticed that ordinary people who still live in these countries, they pay taxes into a system that doesn't really care about them anymore, because what are the taxes for anyway nowadays in countries like the Netherlands or Belgium? You're paying to support corporations do all sorts of infrastructure investments that benefit more of their transnational ideas, so to speak, and much less. We're not investing in our culture anymore. We feel a little bit abandoned by the economy. The economy doesn't serve us anymore. We are serving the economy, but we're not really getting much out of it.
Well, that's
And
what,
I feel that,
good.
yeah, go ahead.
No, 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 you go.
Well, I feel that this is a terrible loss. Like me personally, I know there are people who just want to make money, all right? The materialist worldview, but we are abandoning our spiritual life, so to speak. I think ever since the World War II, also countries like the Netherlands, Germany, France became very atheistic. We became very we started to do away with Christianity. The churches are emptying. And I think that's one of the reasons also why the old paganisms are returning a little bit in Europe. People do feel spiritual, but there is no spiritual organization basically to join anymore. While at the same time, of course, the immigrants are bringing a big block of, well, homogenous Islam, so to speak. And so we don't know how to deal with these things. All these, the big globalist changes that are being imposed upon us from the outside, it really makes us wonder, like, what's the purpose of life, really? It comes down to the question, like, why are we here? What are we really doing here?
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
that's kind of how I would explain that about.
I was reading a book called Eco Republic by Melissa Lane. She's a professor at Princeton, and was talking about the switchover from perceiving the organizing principle of society as ethnicity, ethnos, and changing it to economics. And she talks about like England. Everything comes back to England in
Yeah.
these themes. And Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he starts talking about how, in the very first page, he talks about the baker does not bake bread just for himself. He's not an altruist. He's doing it so that he could trade the bread with the brewer who makes beer. And the brewer who makes beer is not making beer just for himself. He's doing it for his self-interest because he can trade it with, the cobbler who makes shoes. And so you have this self-interest,
Mhm.
this economic self-interest linking society together. And she said very astutely, she said, when a society loses cohesive ethnicity, like when it becomes an empire, when it ceases being a nation and it becomes an empire, now you have a bunch of different ethnicities and languages, and they don't really cohere very well together. They don't stick to each other very well. And she said, so in that, the English solution to that was promoting economics as the binding agent for the society rather than religion, rather than ethnicity. So it's just a corporate state. And like
Mhm.
one of the problems I think with Islam is like there was a military historian named Martin van Creveld, and he talks about how different civilizational models, right? Like we're in, for a lot 1500 years the church ruled Europe, right? And then for
Mhm.
500 years the nation state comes up, and that's a new organizing principle. Islam is back in the older model where
Yeah, exactly.
the
Yeah.
religious, that is the center of their life and not the nation state. So they're at a different civilizational level. And so Van Creveld talks about when you're in the older civilizational level, there is not a perception of a nation per se. Like for instance, he says that nobody spoke of Athens making a decision, but they did say the Athenians made a decision. Nobody spoke of Sparta as an individual, unity, but they
All right.
said
To
the
speak of the people.
Spartans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he said, so what happens when the nation state comes up? Now you've anthropomorphized this state, this political structure, and basically the people stop participating because now because the economic model is you have separation of duties, right? Segregation of duties, and so now you don't feel like it's your responsibility to protect your nation. You've outsourced it to a military, right? This is not true of the organizational principle of religion. It's still they haven't outsourced anything. So you look at a madrasa,
Mhm.
they still see themselves as soldiers. They haven't outsourced it to any.
All
So
right.
what you have are Europeans who are sitting ducks because they're trusting, hey, someone else is going to protect me. And what if that's not true? What if their
Yeah. Yeah.
military isn't working to protect them, but working to protect the mercenaries that they're bringing in? And
Yeah, especially since after World War II in Europe, we have the mentality that the United States is protecting us. They have the nuclear weapons; they will protect us from Russia, and so we just go along with NATO. Yeah. Um, Now I was thinking about. I think I read some article about how Chinese thinkers looked at their civilization, and now, I'm not as knowledgeable as you are. You are. I learn more from you than you from me, probably. But I uh, these Chinese thinkers they realize, okay, we cannot really rely on purely tradition alone. That's probably the Confucian tradition. You look at the past, how they used to do things, and they say, no, we have a new way of figuring out how to relearn how to operate a civilization by looking, for example, at how termites organize themselves. And I get the impression that the communists in the Western world, the socialist Marxist type, they also like to look at human beings as though we are social insects. But I think here's a big problem. Social insects, of course, don't really have a free will. They don't have a brain, right? They have some nerve paths, but that's it. They don't have a spiritual life. They don't have thoughts of themselves. They can perhaps be programmed with algorithms, like the queen or whatever the brain is of a termite colony commands all these creatures to, organize themselves purely for the economics, right? And you also have like different social strata, like you have the soldiers and you have the nurses and the workers and so on. But if you try to impose that on human beings, you will have to effectively remove people's free will. And you have to tell people, well, we don't want you to have a religion anymore. Because people who do think for themselves, people who do have like a spiritual life with their own imaginations, their own wishes and desires, this will always clash with a purely economic hierarchical corporate system, so to speak. And I think there we see a big problem is that human beings are not social insects. We are not going to go along with an algorithmically based digital ID, digital wallet system of the central banks, for example. They want to. I think our Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, she actually proposed at the World Economic Forum recently at Davos to introduce this kind of digital wallet idea, and which gives them the power to lock you out of your bank account, or lock you out of your funds, for example, or even force you to spend it on certain things that they want you to spend it on. So the whole system becomes a system of economic exploitation. But people who want to live a human life, what are they supposed to do? All they can do then is revolt against it and perhaps be punished for it when they try. Right. And so I don't see this ending well. I see you can try to impose this technocracy, right? That's what it's called. Try to impose it on the people, but there's no way that you can keep all people in check. It will be more like Soviet communism lasted for 80 years, 100 years or so. I don't know exactly how long, maybe. And then it collapses, right? And so is that what is happening to the Western world? Are we in like an end phase of this whole technocratic, you call it mercantilism, I think, this mercantilist system where we extract profits, right? From one place of the world, sell it to another place, and then you're just supposed to, be happy, own nothing, eat bugs, and live in a pod. And that is what I personally revolt against these globalists trying to minimize our lives to the point where we become gears in their machine, a machine we didn't even have a vote in, we didn't have a say in it, we weren't asked, right? They call it democracy, but what is democracy right now? It is merely a way to appease people in certain areas, like, okay, you can have some social benefits here and there, but the grand plan, the grand scheme is decided for us in Brussels or in Washington or elsewhere. We have no say in it. And so we are increasingly merely what socialists call the masses, like an anonymous heap of clay that they want to shape and mold into their perfect image, right? But it's not us. They're overruling our personalities, so to speak. They don't give you much room to develop your own personality. I hope this makes sense. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this.
But... Yeah, in the 50s, they called that mass man. There's a guy named Gabriel
Marcel,
who's he's a French philosopher, and he talks about, when people have no soul, they have no religion, they have no purpose in life, they're just told to consume, and that's all they're supposed to do, work in a factory, just make products, and that's all like ants, like you said,
right?
Ants
and that's exactly what I feel most motivated to fight against. I really don't like this, where this is headed. So that's why I was thinking, is it not possible in this big conflict now, maybe we're gearing up to World War III now, right? Because they say that they're going to recruit soldiers in the US and the UK, they have recruiting problems. So it sounds like they're signaling they want to make a push against Russia or something, right? In that conflict, is there a possibility for Europe to return to its roots? Like you mentioned that Islam is on a different civilizational level, but what if we Europeans become way more religious again and don't all new civilizations start with a religious conviction, when we abandon the material economic life and say, okay, we do want to produce things ourselves. So instead of working in an office, we want to actually make the things that we need in our life. Yeah, it's hard to explain. Like I know that in the past, like in the 1800s, most Europeans were peasants. That means the children could see their fathers work out in the field in front of the house. You had a connection with the family there. Nowadays, fathers are working in the office, or even moms are now working in the office. Children are being raised by the state. It's completely deconstructed, right? They're deconstructing the family, deconstructing the biological sex. Everything is going to be, they want to erase and efface everything just so you don't remember that you were actually supposed to be a human being.
That's a good way to put it. I wanted to read an article to you, and it kind of touches on what you were just saying, and regarding recruitment for military. And there was an article on Zero Hedge entitled "White Americans Are Quiet Quitting Our Leading Institutions," and it says, simply put, having perceived their jobs to not have value and meaning, they do no more than absolutely necessary. This debate among scholars as to the extent of the quiet quitting phenomenon But there is increasing evidence that white Americans are increasingly quiet quitting America's leading institutions, and the possible implications of that for American society are profound. This phenomenon is a consequence of the trends I write about in my forthcoming book, The Unprotected Class, about the rise of anti-white racism in American culture and how both formal and informal anti-white discrimination have become a factor in almost every area of American public life. And then it says here, little surprise then that more and more young whites, especially young white men, are looking at the overall environment and saying thanks but no thanks to their leading institutions. Last week, the armed forces announced that the number of white recruits had fallen precipitously over the last 5 years. According to a report at military.com, most of the Army's much discussed incoming recruiting shortfall is due largely to this dramatic decline. While a bit more than 44,000 white Americans signed up to join the Army in 2018, that number cratered to just over 25,000 by 2023, a stunning drop in a short period of time when Black and Hispanic recruiting was largely flat. As a result, white recruits went from 56.4% of soldiers in 2018 to only 44% in 2023. So their system is kind of collapsing because they're openly telling the populace, "Hey, we want to ethnically cleanse you. Come fight for us." It's like, and a lot of them are checking out. They're like, no, I'm not fighting to kill myself.
That is so true. It's like after all these years since I was born, even in the Netherlands, which was at the time in the 1980s, it was quite a socialistic country already. It was quite feministic already, right? We were always supposed to be this guide nation, the beacon for the other European countries to follow us. At least that's how they explained it to us. And then it starts with, well, we are accused of every problem in the world. We are accused of the slavery and of colonialism. And they tell you a very one-sided story. I'm sure you know more about it, is that, Arabs actually started the black slave trade in Eastern Africa. They traded millions of slaves, but we don't talk about it. We only talk about the slavery of the white Europeans, what we did, the part we did, right? And so on and so forth. So it's a very, like the Ottoman Empire also colonized part of Europe, but we never talk about that in the Netherlands. We only say that, oh, the Ottomans actually helped us beat the Spaniards or something. So they give you only the positive history of their side and only the negative of our own. And we always have to feel guilty and ashamed. So guilt and shame become like the two new moral principles that run the Dutch society, at least for the natives, right? And well, what I want, I kind of lost my train of thought, but
well, saying people don't want to fight for a system that wants them
so
dead.
They don't want to fight, and so you get hit with all this negativity. Why would I fight for this? I don't want to fight for diversity and mass immigration and the global open society, the George Soros idea, right? I don't want to fight for any of these things, but they're telling me I have to likely be sent to war against Russia because Russia also opposes the things that I oppose. And that's a bit confusing. Like, I think Russia does not support LGBT. It does not support, well, they do have a diverse society because they have the Chechens and so on. Okay, that's understandable, right? But for us to accept mass immigration and for me to go to war for that, it goes against everything that is good for us. This is not what we want. And you notice this. This is the sentiment among, I think, most men in Europe have absolutely no interest in going to war against Russia for Ukraine. Ukraine isn't even part of the European Union, right? Like I said, the European peoples, their different nations are kind of like different ethnicities. Most German people probably feel nothing for Ukrainians, and Greek people have nothing in common with Norwegians. We live very closely together, but these different peoples, someone from Bulgaria told me, like, what do I have in common with someone from Sweden? Nothing. Europeans may be called white people, but we are extremely diverse ethnically, linguistically people, right? We've never really lived together. The European Union should have been perhaps the experiment to try to get us to live together, but instead they give us mass immigrants from Africa and India. So now we still don't even get to know our own people, right? So we have to deal with, the only thing that unites Europeans today is the fact that every European country is receiving mass Islamic immigration, right? And that's a very negative thing to unite us on. And I'm not going to go to war while I have to leave the borders to my country open to mass immigration. When you notice that African immigrants, they're not going to fight Russia. Most Africans, I understand, the ones who talk to me on TikTok tell me that they support Putin. They support Xi. They think the Chinese are good. They say Europeans are bad because we are the colonials. China doesn't colonize. I think China does colonize, but they see that differently. Maybe China is kinder in a way, and so it wins the Africans over. And so you see this problem here. Yeah, no, the Africans are not going to fight Putin for us. And the Indian people, are they going to fight China for us? I mean, what's the deal here? I think a lot more people in Europe would like the idea of fighting our own governments, the ones who are imposing all this nonsense on us. And so I don't know to what extent these governments will be able to send us to war simply by commanding or ordering us. Maybe a large number of men will eventually go anyway,
And
just
then be
as the
replaced by
Ukrainian men have been
migrants.
sent. Yeah, and then they'll be replaced by migrants. Is that the plan, or is it an accident? If it's the plan, then that's extremely evil.
Well, I mean, just as we were talking about before, what these wars really are about is separating Germany from Russia. So Ukraine is right there, and they're going
Yeah,
to run through Ukraine and kind of devastate its population, replace them with migrants. And after Ukraine is spent, now the CIA is moving to Poland, and they're going to have Poland be that kind of middleman between Germany and Russia to cause problems. Because the whole point is not Russia. The whole point is weakening Europe, is making Europe weak,
yeah,
and that's
exactly.
why
And
Germany gets punished when they trade with Russia, like when they Volkswagen was giving engines to Russia, and then all of a sudden the EU discovers, hey, you're lying about your emissions, and we're going to slap you with all these penalties, and you're going to pay billions. But it was really payback because they were peacefully trading with Russia, and that's a no-no.
yeah, yeah. Maybe I can mention something like when President Obama was elected the first time in the USA. I heard people say in the Netherlands, like people from the suburbs and the countryside, feel like they looking at America, seeing this black man there now. They felt like, hey, the United States does not lead Europe. They're not the leader of the West anymore. And people actually saw Merkel in Germany and said, no, she's also not the leader. And then they see Putin, yeah, and they start literally saying that they felt like Putin was more of a leader of the West than either Merkel or Obama. I think we have a crisis of leadership in the Western world. What we need is, if you want Europe to exist at all, you need some leadership like Otto von Bismarck, for example, who are actually daring, who have the guts to actually do things that are good for Europe, even if that means we will have a different relationship with the United States. If the United States bombs Nord Stream and we in the European media can't even mention that, right? Because this is really strange. If you try to mention that Nord Stream was bombed by the Americans, you say that on German TV, you'll be silenced. They will switch you off. You can't even talk about what actually happens, all because, well, maybe Germany is just an occupied state right now. It's occupied by the USA.
Correct.
And, I do get the impression, sometimes I can speak German, right? So sometimes I watch like German elite people speak and do interviews. I get the impression that they do understand all of this, but there's nothing they can do about it. They just don't have the power to drive the American influence out, so to speak. So they just have to go along with it for the money or so.
Yeah,
and that's sad.
Europe is placed to be very wealthy and very powerful if they finally do what Halford Mackinder was scared of, and they trade peacefully with, the East. You will see the geopolitical center of power shift from England and the United States. I mean, NATO, like in that book, Dream World's a Race that I mentioned twice before, he talks about in the 1870s and 80s, they were talking about how do we reincorporate the United States into England, and their solution was through treaties, right? And eventually they get this after World War II with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so NATO. And so when Trump came and Trump was like, why does NATO exist? They claimed that it was to fight Russia, the USSR, but the USSR isn't there anymore. Why are we paying for this? He didn't understand that it had nothing to do with the USSR. It had been planned since the 1870s. And when he started talking about dismantling it, the English, the Anglo world got very nervous and scared, because what it actually was that legal apparatus by which they took away American sovereignty and they reincorporated it with London. And London is now using the United States. So the United States is not in control of its system. Everything is being
You think
run
it's London?
out of London. Yeah. Like, for instance, in the United States, we talk about the Federal Reserve. They control about 2% of the money, and only domestically. 98% of dollars are outside of US borders, and most of those dollars are controlled out of London, the Eurodollar market in London. So London controls the economic fate of the United States and all these other countries around the world. Like, if to dismantle what's going on, we would have to get rid of their structures. We would have to get rid of the UN. we would have to get rid of NATO. And once that happens, all of a sudden you'll see geopolitical power almost instantly shift back to Germany, to Russia, European Russia. And you know, it'll be a completely different world. But they don't want that to
Yeah.
happen. So the game is to keep Europe divided, or no governments. You don't have governments right now. NATO rules your rules Europe.
Yeah.
They're
Or
all
NATO.
fake
Yeah.
governments. Yeah. And so there's no real hope. And but here's the thing: if you're creating a new corporate state instead of a nation state, right? And this is one of the reasons, by the way, why they're stigmatizing race. When you create a state, race is very useful. Like Bismarck, when Bismarck creates Germany, Albert Camus
Mhm.
said that. He said that there were so little things that the people had in common until he hit upon the idea of a shared ethnicity. And then it comes together. The Zionists use this in Israel. Israel right now is at the beginning of the life
Uh-huh.
cycle of a nation state. So they're very ethnocentric. So when you build a society, ethnocentrism is the norm. When you destroy one, that's when you're like, racism is bad and you're a bad
Oh
person
yeah.
for caring about your people. Oh, you should care about other people, not your own people. You know, that's when you destroy a society, a civilization. And but here's the thing, if you're replacing a legitimate organic state with a corporate state, that requires a requisite amount of intelligence, an IQ threshold to be able to run a complex system. And you've talked about this very
Uh-huh.
effectively in a lot of your tweets. Like if you replace people with 100 IQs with people with 75 IQs, can that complex
Yeah.
system survive?
Yeah. I think you tweeted this article from, what was it called? Palladium Mag. There was an article about this, the competency crisis. And then later I saw that Elon Musk also tweeted out that article. So, you know, yeah, well, this is simply true, right? You have, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter.
Yeah,
Maybe you've heard of it. And
yeah.
well,
I've
he
quoted from it.
explains like what causes the collapse of civilization, and his conclusion was, I think, it's internal. It's like the law of diminishing returns. You
Mhm.
can add more people to economy, but at some point, it doesn't benefit the economy as a whole anymore, and individual people are going to simply leave. They're going to walk out of that society, and I think we have reached that point in the Western world where, I think you mentioned it, the quiet quitting of white men. Why are they quietly quitting? Why are they exiting all sorts of lucrative jobs? It doesn't really, at least not emotionally, reward them anymore. They are looking for something else. If on YouTube you see these videos about guys living off the grid are tremendously popular. They get like millions and millions of views. People are looking at whole new avenues of life that are very different from the corporate cubicle, right? We
Ironically,
want,
that's communism.
yeah. Is that
To
communism?
create a
Okay.
commune, yeah, to create a
All
commune
right. Yeah.
living in other, to get out of the factory setting. And this happened at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At
All
the
right.
beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you had the artisans, and they would make textiles, or they would make shoes, and then suddenly the machines were doing it for a lot cheaper and a lot more, and they were out of jobs. Carnegie, his dad, Andrew Carnegie, the steel billionaire, his dad was a weaver, and he lost his livelihood because of the Industrial Revolution. And he comes to the United States. By the way, Carnegie, once he became very rich, he was still very sympathetic to the British Empire, where he was from originally. And he was one of
All
the
right.
three people who was trying to reincorporate the United States into the British Empire. He spent 30 years of his life. And he,
Wow.
ironically, despite being rich, he had socialistic tendencies. He wanted to recreate guild socialism that his dad wanted, because that was the feudal system that they were used to in the feudal
Uh-huh.
ages, and they wanted to recreate it. And that's a lot of what we're seeing now, is these elites who want to take us back to the feudal system where the corporation emerged from for the first, the mercantile guilds in the Middle Ages. And you mentioned earlier, I think I talked about this in another podcast, but I
Uh-huh.
was reading about the history of the Fabian Socialists, and they were funded by
Yeah.
Cecil Rhodes, and they wanted to tear down the current system and create guild socialism. And they said the two influences on their thinking were Henry George, who was an American, and he didn't believe that land should be owned by people. The state should own the land, so you will own
All
nothing,
right.
right? And then they said the
Yeah.
other person was John Stuart Mill, who wrote a great essay on socialism. And John Stuart Mill is very famous for saying, society should be run for the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So you have two components. You will own nothing, that's Henry George, and you will be happy. That's John Stuart Mill. And so you look at the World Economic Forum,
They
they're
bring it
basically,
together. Yeah.
yeah, they're doing what the Fabian socialists set out to do in the 1870s, and they've quietly been
Wow.
working at it. And their name, as you know, probably was from a Roman general, Fabianus Cunctator, who basically played the long game. He didn't expect success immediately, but he would kind of mull in, and it might take a long, 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 long time, and it might look like you're losing, but you stay in, you subvert systems from within, and eventually you win. And so the Fabian socialists said, we're going to do that. We're not going to be like the other radicals. We're not going to be with pitchforks and torches and yelling, hurling bombs. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to put on a suit. We're going to go in the institutions and we're going to collapse
Mhm.
them from within. And they talked about in the 1870s, they were talking about using the pension funds of workers to buy into corporations and then to subvert the corporations, like what BlackRock is doing now with Larry Fink. So we're living in their world. They wanted an Anglo world. They wanted, like, they
Yeah.
created the white paper for the International Court at The Hague, the League of Nations. They were like, all these apparatuses were out of England. And England, used the Fabian socialists as their tacticians, and their main goal was to get us back to the feudal system. They called it guild socialism, as I
Yeah.
said, and that's what the World Economic Forum. It's the direct descendant of all this stuff. If essentially all roads lead back to England. If England goes down, if we take down that financial system, we're going
Yeah.
to see people get their freedom back. But right
Yeah, I
now,
wonder. I wonder if that's a possibility. Like you mentioned pensions, and I feel in Europe we have this. I think this European system that started to take control of all the pension funds, and they have this massive amount of money, and you always wonder, like, what are they really doing with it, right? It sounds like they're using this money, pension money, to try to fuse Europe with Africa to create a sort of Euro-African Union, right? But you need money to do that, so they take it from the pensioners, and then
mhm.
they kill off the boomers a little quicker, right? Like, I mean, I saw this in Canada. There's this massive promotion of euthanasia, and there was this video of a woman who explains that they're actually targeting, white people, white families, because they have families and they have wealth, so get rid of them first.
They're the only
But
ones in the
that,
commercial. All the other
yeah,
commercials are
they're exactly,
diverse,
yeah.
but the only commercial with all whites is for euthanasia.
Yeah. You notice that, yeah. And then, you know, combine it. Well, we're talking about complex system. You combine it with what's happening with the farmer revolts in Europe. You have it now in Germany, the Netherlands, France, Romania, Italy. All the farmers are revolting. But why is that? Why do these World Economic Forum elites want to get rid of traditional farming? Is it because they want to grow food in a factory or something, and so they sell you food as a subscription or something, and it becomes a very different kind of food, like more not something you actually eat from the soil, or no fruit from the tree, but it's more like grub or something, like Soylent Green or something, right? And I felt that the reason they want to get rid of farmers is also because most farmers in Europe are obviously native European types. So you cut them loose. What you do is you are severing the ties between the native peoples and their food system and the land.
And the
You're
soil.
uprooting
Yeah.
people. Yeah, you're uprooting people. So that also later, if you wanted to have a native revolt or rebellion against the governments, how are they going to feed themselves if the farmers are gone? If the World Economic Forum elites control the food supplies totally, right? Because they control the supermarkets anyway, but now they will also control the food production. Then there's no way you can have a Che Guevara style guerrilla war on the governments, because where are you going to hide? There's no more farms. Where are you going to eat? There's no more farmers. And so they're preparing probably for making Europeans entirely dependent on them. And then, with the digital wallet and with other tools that they're implementing, they make us slaves. We become slaves, and we will have no other choice but to do exactly what they tell us to do. And that, to me, is not a life worth living. Then it basically begs for a pushback, a revolt, so to speak,
Yeah.
because you just can't. What's the point?
You mentioned Joseph Tainter before, and Joseph Tainter
Yeah.
talks about the late Bronze Age collapse, and that was one of the failures of globalization, where you had five empires and they all decided to specialize, right? Like in globalization, division of labor. So why do I have to make food? I'll just make swords, and Egypt can make the food, and this other empire can make this good or that good, and we'll just trade. Everything is peaceful trade. Like we hear that now. Free trade is the solution to everything. And then a drought came, the crops failed in Egypt, and
Mhm.
everyone starved. And all five empires collapse, and like the
Wow.
Greeks, it was so bad the Greeks forgot how to write for 800 years.
Huh.
So yeah, so when you have a complex system and it goes down, it's a very long time before it comes back, before you get those technologies back, kind of like the Dark Ages in Europe. And it took until the Renaissance for us to get back to Aristotle, Plato, systematic thought.
Mhm.
It took a long, long time. And so if they're going to collapse, what's happening now through very similar means, just by different methods, but
Yeah.
like starvation, taking food away from people, and you'll see, kind of places collapse. It's going to be a long, long time. And if they change the demographics, they may never come back. Like North Africa, when its demographics changed, never came back. They had very stable demographics since the Upper Paleolithic. The
Mhm.
Berber populations, they were very Europoid. They were redheads, Riffian Berbers. They have the fourth
Oh,
highest
wow.
rates of red hair and blue eyes. And then when the Arabs breached the Sahara in the 800s, the demographics of North Africa changed, and it never came. It
Yeah.
never flourished again, and because it's very hard to run a complex system with a population with a much lower IQ than the people who created that system. And it goes back to that article that you referenced before. Let me see, I pulled it up. Complex systems won't survive the competence crisis. And it says, at a casual glance, the recent cascades of American disasters might seem unrelated. In a span of fewer than 6 months in 2017, three U.S. naval warships experienced three separate collisions, resulting in 17 deaths. A year later, power lines owned by PG&E started a wildfire that killed 85 people. The pipeline carrying almost half of the East Coast gasoline shut down due to a ransomware attack. Almost 500,000 intermodal containers sat on cargo ships unable to dock at Los Angeles ports. A train carrying thousands of tons of hazardous and flammable chemicals derailed near East Palestine, Ohio. Air traffic control cleared a FedEx plane to land on a runway occupied by a Southwest plane preparing for takeoff. Eye drops contaminated with antibiotic-resistant bacteria killed 4 and blinded 14. While disasters like these are often front-page news, the broader connection between the disasters barely elicits any mention. America must be understood as a system of interwoven systems. The healthcare system sends a bill to a patient using the postal system, and that patient uses the mobile phone system to pay the bill with a credit card issued by the banking system. All these systems must be assumed to work for anyone to make even simple decisions. But the failure of one system has cascading consequences for all the adjacent systems. As a consequence of escalating rates of failure, America's complex systems are slowly collapsing. And he basically, puts it to the fact that they're systematically removing people with 100 IQs and for political reasons replacing them with
Yeah.
people with 75 IQs. And so we start to collapse into a third world country.
Right. I always felt that the reason they do that is to buy the African market. You're going to have you have 1 billion young people there, and they say that by the end of the century, there's going to be like 3 billion people living in Africa. So that's a massive market for you to sell your Starbucks, your shoes, your Nike, and so on, right? As opposed to say an aging old Europe or an aging old white middle class in the USA. And you want to sell them financial products. You want to sell them mortgages and housing and so on, right? You
Yeah,
want to, that's what they call financial inclusion, is to sell them mortgages that basically make them financial slaves.
correct.
Uh, and, and, and they're using whatever they can do to do that. But then of course they have to promote them, right? They don't want Africans to support China. So what do we have in the West? What can we give Africans to get them to side with us? Well, you give them Hollywood movies, you give them roles, and you make them president of Harvard and so on, to put their faces in these top positions, so they can start to identify with the West more than with China, because Chinese people, they look Chinese, right? They don't
Interesting.
have Chinese movies with their faces, right? So I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to market the West to the African demographic,
Mhm.
but only for money, for profit, so that the billionaires can make more money, of course. I mean, the shareholders of most of these companies, of course, are still, what do you call them, Anglo-Saxon, whatever type of people. And so that's what I think they're doing. Yeah. They're just using their marketing trickery, the same things they did to us, that they did to the Western European middle class. They're doing it now to Africa. Uh,
That's a
but
good
it's
analysis.
not, yeah, it's not a benefit for like Europeans are losing, and the white middle class is going to lose. They're going to get hurt by this. I mean, they're basically dumped, as in, okay, we don't want you anymore. You're not a profitable demographic anymore. Goodbye.
Well, there
And
there
then
was
you're
a,
replaced.
a woman called Karen Ragusin, and she wrote a book called The End of Scarcity. And she is an economist, and she was explaining at the beginning of her book why the 2008 financial collapse happened. And she said it was because, not because of the housing market. She said there was deeper problems, and she said basically all of our money is debt. Right. So we don't actually have real money. We have anti-money. Like real money is backed by an asset like gold or something, right? Our money
Mhm.
comes into the system when debt is created, whether you take a loan on a house, $100,000 loan, $100,000 comes into the system when that loan is created, or when the government prints treasury bonds, that's money that's newly created. So only when we go into debt is new money created. And so the guys that she's talking to in the story, he was like, "So you mean when I have $100 in my bank, that's because someone else owes $100?" And she's like, "Yeah." So he was like, "So if everybody paid off their debt, what would happen to the money?" And she was like, "We would have a deflationary crisis. Transactions couldn't happen if we got out of debt. So the system needs debt slaves." And what she said, and it gets back to your point, she said the West is tapped out. Everybody is in debt. They can't go into any more debt. So what they're doing now is they're doing mass migration to create new debt slaves so that the system can keep
Yeah.
going. And that's what it's actually about. Another thing playing into that as well, that would be just a system run amok that is trending towards suicide. And H.G. Wells warned about that in 1944 in his last book, The Mind at the End of Its Tether. He said corporations are sociopathic. They don't have a guiding intelligence. And he saw corporations, basically, leading us off a cliff, and we're dying. Because in the old monarchical system, you had a king who had a guiding intelligence. But with shareholders, you have diffuse responsibility and no guiding intelligence. And so stupid things are allowed to happen, suicidal things. And this might be one of them. But another thing I wanted to bring, I have little notes here. The
All right.
OSS, the forerunner to the CIA in 1944, they had this document on how to collapse, how to sabotage companies and institutions because they wanted to hurt the Germans. So they were giving people, how do you sabotage those things? And one of the techniques they said in that document was to promote people who were unqualified to positions of power. And this would have a twofold effect. One would be, those people are too stupid to run a complex system, so it's sabotage. But secondly, the competent people who were not getting the promotions would get so frustrated they would quit. And this is
Mhm.
what's behind the quiet quitting phenomenon, where you know that if you're the wrong race and you work really hard and you're really good at your job and you don't get the promotion, you're like, why bother?
Right.
If
Yeah.
they're
Why
giving
bother?
it,
But also, why work for people who are less competent? So you're not going to do that. Then you
yep.
just go do something else.
Yeah, you start your own business. Like Elon Musk couldn't get hired, and so it forced him. He had 2 degrees. He was creating video games when he was 13 years old. He goes out to Silicon Valley. To this day, no one has returned his resumes. No one has responded to his curriculum vitae, and so he had to create his
Wow.
own business, and he became a billionaire. And so other people, when they get discriminated against in the job site, and these corporations and organizations are being sabotaged, they're like, "Why am I working here?" I have no hope of advancement no matter how hard I work because I've been targeted for extermination, So let me create my own
Right.
business. And so it's leading to this institutional kind of, dissolution. It's falling
Right.
apart.
But it does create a pool of disenfranchised, highly competent people. And the question is, what are they going to do? They have, I think, a window of opportunity to start something new. Like if you would pull them together, pull resources together, right? Start your own little organization, you may have a revolution on your hand that might harm these elites. You might, in Europe, for example, take over Brussels, for example, and transform it into something more useful. Because these people, like these competent people who quit their jobs, they have maybe 5 years, 10 years or so where they're at the top of their field. They have the ability to do a lot of organizationally speaking, but then what are they going to do? And maybe well, I fantasize about getting those kind of people organized and actually just taking back what we lost, or starting something new. It doesn't matter what it is. You can take over or start over. Doesn't matter, as long as we do something,
It
rather
starts
than
with what you're doing
yeah.
already. It starts with you saying, no, I'm proud. You're not going to
Yeah,
make me ashamed of who I am. You're not going to make me ashamed of my past. You're not going to make me
exactly.
ashamed
Yeah,
of any of the lies, because most of the things that they're attributing to your past aren't actually your real history. They're lying,
true.
And so
Yeah,
you have
they're
to,
lying. Yeah.
yeah, you have to get off your knees and say, no,
Yeah.
I don't believe you. In fact, I think you're the evil one. You have to turn it
Right.
around
Yeah.
on
Turn
them.
it around. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and
Turn it
stop
around. Let them sort it
apologizing.
out. Yeah.
We saw this in the
Yeah.
United States with the Civil War. When the South lost the Civil War, the North, for the 150 years afterwards, would stigmatize the South and break their morale, tell them they're bad, they're stupid, they're hicks, oh, they're just ridiculous and retarded, and all the TV shows would have stupid characters with Southern accents, and
All
that's how they
right.
would predict shame into them, so that they could control them. And we saw the same thing happen with Germany after World War II. And now they're using the
Yeah.
technique that they had honed after the Civil War, and then with Germany, and now they've spread it to all the Western nations. They're using the exact same techniques of you're
Yeah.
bad,
Yeah.
you're unsophisticated, you're just a racist bigot. But there will be a renaissance once that stops working on people, and they stop. And the
Yeah.
guilt only works on an ethical populace. The fact that they're using kind of moral arguments to make you commit suicide.
You're
There
right.
has to
Yeah.
be a point where you're like, no, I think you're the immoral one. I'm ethical.
Yeah.
Me caring about my people is highly ethical. You're the immoral one.
Yeah. I definitely represent that trend on my TikTok channel. Yeah, I constantly speak about this. Like they accuse us of so many things and just it's just not true, or they're not highlighting the other people's bad side and so on. Like I'm beyond this. The guilt trip and the shaming for our colonial history, that doesn't have any effect on me anymore. I just want to have, my own future. And
Nope.
I don't mind seceding or separating if I have to. Like if we could create, I don't know, sometimes you can fantasize about what if Siberia thaws up? Could you move people there? Or what if the inland of Greenland thaws up, right? If global warming is real and the ice melts, there's so tons of places that will become habitable. Can you move there? So that's a fantasy, but then I don't mind going in any direction as long as I'm not going to accept the shame and guilt anymore. That's just over.
Yeah,
We have
shame, guilt, and
a real
death.
life to live. Yeah.
Yeah, take the euthanasia, step into the chamber. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's over now. So anyway,
Definitely. Yeah.
how can people find your work, Johannes?
Well, on my TikTok mostly at the Great Johannes, and on my newsletter www.jmk.info. If they want to subscribe there, they can go there. That's basically my two channels. Yeah.
Sweet, awesome. Okay, well,
All
I
right.
hope I can have you again, and you were awesome. Thank you for watching. If you're interested, hit the like and subscribe buttons. And also, if you'd like, you can check out one of my new enterprises. It's going to be called Classic Paranormal, and it's a podcast over in Apple iTunes. So run over there right now, and you can hear me read classic case literature. Sounds boring, but it's actually quite fascinating. Ghost stories and spooks and goblins and psychics and materialization phenomena, apports, and more. Go to Apple, iTunes, or Spotify, Classic Paranormal, and I will catch you next time.